Of all the periods of the history of Western art, the Renaissance period of the early 16th century can still legitimately claim to be the greatest of them all. The artistic discoveries and achievements of men such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian, amongst many others, were so significant that it is perhaps understandable that many of the artists who followed them in the later 1500s could do little more than work in the style or manner of these great masters, especially the later Michelangelo. This was the age of mannerism, a period which saw the creation of much fine art, but a period that would quickly be superseded across Europe by a far more significant age, the age of the Baroque. The word derives from the Portuguese word barroco, meaning an irregularly shaped pearl. We can be sure, however, that by the end of the 18th century, the word was being used by art critics in a derogatory sense to describe the art of the previous century, which many considered to be, at best, decadent, and at worst, irrelevant. These widespread opinions would not last, however, and the art of the Baroque age, corresponding roughly to the 17th century, is now considered to be one of the most interesting in art history.
Baroque painting and sculpture breaks the rules which we've seen in previous painting. We get perhaps far more dramatic kind of compositions where there are extremes of light and dark, from spotlit drama to deep, deep shadows. We break away from Renaissance, painted on a stage set. We become participants and spectators much closer in a drama which is taking place before us. An increase in scale and an increased palette and perhaps more vigorous brushwork too.
The return to Baroque signals almost a return to a natural sort of format, a realistic sort of settings with contemporary people interacting with religious scenes. You get this extension outwards of space and its versatility. Characteristics are the quality of light, the quality of color.
The birthplace of the Baroque age in art can be traced not to Northern Europe, where these changes in society were perhaps the most pronounced, but to Rome, at the end of the 16th century, and the work of two artists who produced their greatest work there, Carracci and Caravaggio. Born in Bologna in 1560, Annibale Carracci was a member of a family of talented artists who founded the first modern art academy in their home city, a significant development in itself. For the first time in the modern age, art technique was formally taught to students. But Annibale Carracci would prove himself a master when he moved to Rome in 1595 to take on a truly enormous commission: to fresco the gallery ceiling in the Palazzo Farnese with love scenes of pagan gods, as described by the Roman poet Ovid. It would be a 7-year labor that would make Carracci's name. Just to execute such a work on this scale represents an enormous achievement. But the actual figures depicted by Carracci are especially significant to the art historian. They are undeniably human, free of the stylistic distortion of form that characterized much of the Mannerist art of the time.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We aim to bring you only the most dramatic and fascinating stories of the past through our award-winning documentaries. Find out about the rise of leaders such as Cleopatra and Napoleon in our latest offering of exclusive documentaries. Sign up now for a free trial, and Perspective fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code PERSPECTIVE at checkout.
The second of the important Italian artists of the early Baroque was born Michelangelo Merisi in 1573 in a small North Italian town which would give him the name by which we know him today, Caravaggio. Like his compatriot Carracci, Caravaggio moved to Rome as a young artist and quickly became known not just to fellow artists and patrons, but to the magistrates and officers of the law. Temperamental, With a propensity for violence that in 1606 led to his being charged with murder, it was perhaps this strong individualistic streak of Caravaggio's that informed his undoubted artistic masterpieces, the greatest of which depict religious subject matter.
He used very, very strong contrast of light and dark. He highlighted pictures so that almost the figures, the drama, almost kind of lit by a stage light. All extraneous detail is excluded, so our eyes are focused on the human drama of the scene.
His enthusiasm for depicting humanity as it appeared to his eye would prove inspirational to Baroque artists across Europe. As the 17th century progressed, however, Italian Baroque artists began to develop a particularly grandiose style, inspired once again by the papacy, who looked for suitable pomp and splendor to glorify the Catholic Church. One of the main individuals of this era is considered by many to be the greatest figure of the Baroque era in Italy, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, a master of painting and architecture, but particularly sculpture. Born in 1598, Bernini's role in the development of Baroque Rome and the creation of the grand Italian style was central, and he won commissions from many monarchs and religious leaders of the period. Much of Bernini's work was related to the building of St. Peter's in Rome, continued from the previous century. With his 100-foot-high bronze altar canopy over the altar of St. Peter's, commissioned by Pope Urban VIII, Bernini blurred the boundaries between sculpture and architecture in a remarkable display of grandeur. His work was obviously very much in keeping with the Church's requirements. Urban VIII was only the first of 7 popes for whom Bernini would work. But perhaps the finest example of Bernini's work, and one which encapsulates many of the themes of the Baroque, is another sculpture that can still be seen in Rome. It is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, a marble 3 meters high in the Cornaro Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. It represents a visionary nun of the 16th century who, in one of her spiritual experiences, imagined being joyfully pierced by an arrow from an angel's bow. A work full of movement and intensity, notably in the tortured and ecstatic expression of the saint herself, it is Bernini's use of light that is the piece's most remarkable feature. By positioning the marble in front of rays of bronze below an invisible window through which the light pours, Bernini creates an utterly compelling illusion of light descending from heaven. Perhaps more than any other work, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa expresses the flavor of Italian Baroque. But to the north, in Protestant Holland, the situation for the visual artist was very different from that in Flanders and the rest of Catholic Europe. The Protestant churches were utterly opposed to the patronage of visual art, interpreting such images as graven and forbidden by Scripture. So, artists in Holland, for instance, increasingly had to look for new ways to make a living. Since altarpieces and church ceilings, to name but 2 commissions favored by the Catholic Church, were no longer required, Dutch artists were compelled to focus on portraits, landscapes, seascapes, still life, anything, in fact, that the artist considered sellable. Although this meant poverty for many unsuccessful artists, this expansion of subject matter considered suitable as art would prove ultimately to be a liberating development. Born in 1606 in the Dutch town of Leiden, Rembrandt van Rijn spent the bulk of his working life in Amsterdam, where many of his greatest works can be seen today. Although such is the volume and quality of his lifetime oeuvre, it is difficult for the would-be explorer of Rembrandt to know where to start. It may be that his portraits provide the best starting point. Rembrandt's skill as a portraitist, however, is perhaps best illustrated by his images of himself, his self-portraits. Time and again he rendered his own image on the canvas, over 60 times in total, creating in the process a visual history of the life of the artist. At no point does he ever attempt to present himself on the canvas as anything other than what he was, a physically imperfect man. It is perhaps because of this great series of portraits that so many people feel a close personal affinity with Rembrandt's work. Despite his financial difficulties, Rembrandt was undoubtedly the giant of 17th century Dutch art. But, perhaps because of the specific nature of the art market in Holland, he was not the only fascinating artist at work at the time. With the absence of religious commissions, still life painting began to grow in popularity, a genre whose greatest exponent was probably Willem Cuyp. Landscapes, too, would provide work for the Dutch artist, and Jacob van Ruysdael's view of Haarlem takes the modern viewer straight back to the flatlands of 1670s Holland. But perhaps more interesting than these fine works are the creations of the final great artist of the 17th century, Jan Vermeer. If Rembrandt's was the most prodigious output of the 17th century Dutch masters, then there can be little doubt that Jan Vermeer's was the least. Just 35 canvases of his can be seen today, including some portraits and landscapes. But for his most significant work, Vermeer chose to depict simple domestic scenes, utterly unremarkable in themselves, but transformed by Vermeer into art that delights to this day. A calm approach to the distribution of light, a precise approach to color, and, perhaps most significantly, a superb arrangement of space can be seen in images like Young Woman with a Water Jug and The Kitchen Maid Pouring Milk. But it is this elevation of the human, the ordinary, everyday human, to center stage in what is undoubtedly fine art, that is, by far, the most significant aspect of Vermeer's work. And although some critics suggest that Vermeer is not in the strictest sense an artist of the Baroque, it is perhaps appropriate that his paintings of real humans doing real things in real places should conclude any journey through the Baroque period, a period that, as we have seen, was integral to the evolution of art.
Literature does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by social and cultural change. The style of poetry that emerged in the early 17th century was a response to the spirit of the age. In a period when many traditions were being challenged, new patterns of thought and feeling formed. Scientific advances had challenged established ideas about the Earth's place in the universe. A mood of anxiety, created as old certainties faded, was heightened by divisive religious and political upheavals. These changes threatened the status quo and the concept of the divine right of kings. The early years of the 17th century lay between two major upheavals in English society, the Reformation and the Civil War. These cataclysmic events were part of the process of transition which transformed society from medieval to modern.
Then there was the increasing impact of new discoveries, both geographical discoveries from across the world and ideas on the structure of the universe. The old ideas of the Ptolemaic universe, which saw the Earth as a centre, was now generally known to have been replaced by Copernicus's theories that the sun was the centre of the universe. And this was such a shocking idea that people reacted as if the universe had actually been reorganised, not merely we had a different theory about it. So it could be used as an image of dissolution, of destruction, and there was much talk of the coming of the end of the world, partly as a result of that. So it's a very exciting period to live in, and all these influences and pressures are there in the poetry.
Metaphysical poetry deals most frequently with issues central to this uncertain world. Although love, in its many forms, is a major theme, the poets also address the progress of the soul, religion, and the state. One of the characteristic literary devices used by the metaphysical poets is the conceit. This is a piece of imagery which unites disparate objects and sustains their apparent likeness throughout the poem. Donne's poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, is the source of one particularly well-known conceit, the comparison of lovers to a pair of compasses.
If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do.
Donne is the most renowned of the metaphysical poets. His poetry is memorable for its wide-ranging exploration of love in its various forms, be that divine, sexual, or platonic. Donne conveys the intimate world of complete sexual love in The Good Morrow.
And now good morrow to our waking souls, which watch not one another out of fear, for love all love of other sights controls, and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone, let maps to others worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one.
Donne's treatment of love is complex and varied. He interlinks different forms of love. Religious and sexual love in particular are blended in his poetry. Lovers become spiritual figures as their relationship rises from the physical.
At its most profound level, Platonic love transcends the body and moves on to a kind of divine love, as Bembo states in Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. The lover is supposed to look at the mistress's soul as much as he looks at her body.
In his third satire, Donne confronts the religious turmoil of the age. By encouraging a search for the true religion, he charts the progression of religious practice. The poem moves from the history of the Catholic Church founded in Rome to the emergence of Calvinism with its Northern European roots. This journey mirrors Donne's personal religious progression.
Having been brought up as a Roman Catholic and then becoming an Anglican with an emphasis on a Calvinist attitude, I think he found this a very tense area. The Calvinist idea was that you were predestined for salvation or not, and the individual was supposed to strive hard to be good in order to discover which fate was meted out to them. I think it's a very uncomfortable belief, and Donne seems to have agonised over his relationship to God. If we take the poems personally, which I think we often should.
His poems do not concentrate simply on the outward manifestation of faith. They also address the progress of his own soul and express doubts about his relationship with God. These are most clearly seen in his divine poems.
O God, O of thine only worthy blood, and my tears make a heavenly Lethean flood, and drown in it my sin's black memory. That thou remember them, some claim as debt. I think it mercy, if thou wilt forget.
In the Divine Meditations, we find a period of Donne's reflection on his own sinfulness and on his need for salvation. Now, Donne, however, is never self-effacing, not even in these poems. He's constantly at the center of his own attention. The only constant habit he can discover in himself is that he's in fact inconstant.
In what was undoubtedly a golden age for drama, it is not surprising that Donne's poetry reflects the influences of those dramatists who were his contemporaries. The style of Donne's poetic voice is allied to the dramatic language of these playwrights. Many of his poems have startling and dramatic openings that immediately involve the reader.
For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love, or chide my palsy or my gout.
I do not think melodramatic is an appropriate term to attach to Donne. He exaggerates sometimes, but to me melodrama suggests emotion or excitement in excess of the situation being described. What I would say, though, is he's a very dramatic poet.
The conversational quality of the dialogue and the powerful imagery which permeates much of Donne's work takes us beyond the confines of the poem. The reader is able to envisage the action being played out. In his poem The Flea, Donne creates a whole scene from a conversation in which he attempts to prevent his lover killing a flea.
Oh stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is.
The poem is ultimately about the narrator trying to persuade his mistress to sleep with him. The first stanza centers on the flea. In the second stanza, the mistress is threatening the flea. And in the third stanza, the flea is squashed by the mistress. Now, the narrator tries to plead for the life of the flea and rebukes his mistress for killing the animal. The mistress is never allowed to speak, but we can gather her words and actions from the narrator's words. So a little drama evolves here within the poem, and it's really not a simple soliloquy or monologue, but a well-constructed drama.
The early 17th century was an age which created a new framework of ideas about man, society, and nature. Although Donne was not a philosopher, his poetry explores the issues which dominated the years in which he wrote. His poetic style of debate was a perfect vehicle for his pursuit of resolutions to disturbing issues. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the work of the metaphysical poets became unfashionable. Their reputation was revived in the early 20th century. An ingenious use of ideas and language, as well as their ability to sustain a close line of argument, appealed to modern poets. The ability of the metaphysical poets to express the experience of loving links them to poetry throughout the centuries. Human love is an enduring theme. What distinguishes the treatment of love by the metaphysical poets is its use as an overarching theme within which they addressed the major issues of their age.
The young prince was the eldest son of the pretender, James, and his Polish wife, Klementyna Sobieska. Growing up in the cosmopolitan world of the exiled Stuart court was certainly a colourful existence, and the young prince and his brother, Henry, benefited from a wealth of varied experiences, which produced a strong, fit young man who loved to ride, hunt, play music and dance, all of which he mastered with equal ease. He may well have received an excellent schooling, but as he grew into manhood, the prince did reveal a couple of worrying traits, which were never to leave him. The first was his profligacy. He spent lavishly on himself, always dressing in the finest clothes, and loving nothing better than to have his portrait painted. The Stuart household accounts for 1743, for example, show that Charles's personal expenditure was 3 times as much as his brother, and 10 times as much as his father. Despite his flaws, Charles grew up to become a fit, handsome and athletic young man. So he was physically prepared for action and hardship when the distant prospect of regaining the throne of Britain flickered back to life. In 1744, Britain and France became embroiled in yet another war, and despite all their previous experiences, some Scots Jacobites were planning yet another rising. Now nearly 60 years of age, the old pretender wisely passed up the prospect of a further forlorn attempt at his elusive prize. However, James considered French military help a distinct possibility. and the 24-year-old Prince Charles, with the rashness of youth, was prepared to stake everything on one last throw of the dice. Charles left Rome and slipped into France in the hope that his presence would provoke the French king, Louis, into action on behalf of the Stuarts. He was to be disappointed. In the year he spent in France, the prince never once met Louis. Louis XV of France continually refused to grant Charles an audience. In the end, Charles was reduced to writing to Louis, begging for a meeting.
After having tried in vain all methods of reaching your majesty, in the hope of obtaining the help necessary to enable me to play a role worthy of my birth, I have resolved to make myself known by my actions, and to undertake alone a project to which even a small amount of help would guarantee success.
Suddenly, in 1744, there was a glimmer of hope. The French unexpectedly sanctioned and prepared an invasion in support of the Stuarts. A French fleet sailed, with Charles aboard, but after a fierce storm sank some of their transports, it returned to France, and the young prince was consigned to a frustrating year ashore. Charles Edward Stuart was clearly not a man to take a hint. Frustrated beyond endurance, he resolved to raise the money himself to finance a small expedition to Scotland and lead another rebellion in his father's name. The rash adventure had begun. Landing with only 7 companions at Arisaig on the west coast of Scotland, the prince did not give the appearance of a man about to lead a triumphant crusade. The larger of his 2 ships had been intercepted and attacked by British warships, but the clan chiefs grudgingly agreed to support a rising in the belief that they would be assisting a coming invasion by French regular troops. Here at Glenfinnan, on the 19th of August 1745, the prince's standard was raised, more in hope than expectation. At first, it seemed none would come. Then, in a fairy tale moment, like an episode from a romantic novel, the sound of pipes were heard echoing down the empty glen. Much against their better judgment, here were Cameron of Lochiel, the MacDonalds of Glengarry, the men of Keepock, and the young Clan Ranald and his followers. The rising had begun. Once raised, the prince's small army marched on Edinburgh. As they marched southward, additional numbers came in, swelling the ranks to 1,200 men. And suddenly there was hope, where there had only been uncertainty. As the prince could spare no men to garrison the city, on the 1st of November 1745, Edinburgh was abandoned, and the invasion of England begun. The army marched on London, against the expressed wishes of almost all the Highland chiefs. The invasion progressed rapidly. By avoiding Hawley's strong government army at Newcastle, the Jacobites were soon in control of Manchester. Despite the fact that church bells rang and crowds came to cheer, the prince was devastated to find that there were pitifully few volunteers prepared to actually join the rebellion. Less than 300 of his prospective English subjects actually joined the prince's army. The Duke of Cumberland, with the second government army, more than twice the size of Charles's, tried to intercept the Jacobites near Lichfield, but they bypassed him too, and by the 4th of December were at Derby, only 120 miles from London. There, the young pretender and his officers argued for 2 days about what to do next. Charles was for pushing on to London, but the others disagreed. The French had not landed, and that crucially there was no sign of real support from the English population. In the end, Charles had to accept their decision, but he evermore considered himself betrayed by the Highland chiefs. their differences would ultimately escalate into all-out war.
The main reason why the Council of War decided to turn back was the absence of English support and the belief that the reiterated promises of Charles about French and English support were in fact wildly over-optimistic, not to say downright misleading.
With the fateful decision to turn north, the Jacobite cause had reached its high watermark. On the 6th of December, the small army turned around and began retreating northwards. The conquering heroes were now treated with scorn and derision by the same crowds who had cheered them so heartily. For the Duke of Cumberland, this was the last straw. He now set out to destroy the prince's cause once and for all. His army was powerful and well equipped. Crucially, he could also call on 3 times as many troops as Charles. Cumberland was not to be deterred. His sudden advance caught the Jacobite army by surprise, and there was no real option left but to fight. To reach the government forces, the Highlanders had to charge across an open expanse of moorland, all the while exposed to the cannons and muskets of well-drilled opponents. Most Highlanders did not even reach the government lines.
At Culloden, though, it all went wrong. Partly because the Highlanders had a long way to go. As you can see there, that red flag more or less marks where this started off from. So it's 500 metres down to where the government force was standing. The regulars didn't panic. The Highlanders came rushing up, expecting the redcoats to run away, and they didn't. They stood there, they shot them, they shot them, and they shot them.
The full weight of the Highland attack fell upon just 2 government regiments, Barrel's and Monroe's. In the brief struggle which followed, 200 government soldiers were killed or wounded in a vicious hand-to-hand fight. But for the first time, the discipline of the government troops held firm, and despite the ferocity of the Highlanders' attack, the prince's men were soon halted. Just as quickly, they turned to fight. In the space of those terrible minutes, 800 clansmen were killed or wounded. It was at about this time that Prince Charles himself made his escape. Lord Elcho, the leader of his own bodyguard, is alleged to have called bitterly after him, "Run, you cowardly Italian." With Elcho's cry ringing in his ears, he rode off the field with a small escort of French cavalry to look to his own destiny. Finally, Charles was able to escape to France, suffering the ignominy of having to disguise himself as a woman to do so. Flora MacDonald was the woman who helped him. Contrary to popular opinion, no love was lost between them, and she paid the price for helping the prince, with a year in jail. Safely back in France, Charles assumed the role of society hero. He was cheered and applauded wherever he went. But King Louis, who now sought peace with England, considered the prince to be a political embarrassment. He was incensed to hear of Charles basking in the public adoration, visiting the opera, and preening himself in public, despite Louis's explicit instruction for him to remain incognito.
He wouldn't leave France, and Louis had to have him kidnapped at the opera and forcibly exiled. That was felt bitterly by Charles Edward, by his supporters, and by the French public, for whom Charles Edward was a hero.
Charles was now back in Italy. Like the cause he espoused, the affairs of Prince Charles Edward had reached their high watermark. The rest of his life was a slow decline into obscurity and alcoholism. There is something terribly poignant about the legendary figure, who will forever be celebrated as a dazzling young man, slipping into old age, senility, and drunkenness. Perhaps it would have been better if he had not sought to save his own skin, and been killed at Culloden with his men. Then, at least, he would have been revered forever. The bonny Prince Charlie of legend.
The music of Antonio Vivaldi is best known to us through just one of his compositions, the Four Seasons. Yet there are well over 500 other works that survive: sonatas, symphonies, concertos. He also wrote a considerable number of operas and oratorios, but it is as a composer of instrumental music that he is chiefly remembered. He was born in Venice in 1678, the son of a barber who was also an accomplished violinist, apparently one of the best in the city. Antonio also played the violin. The continual mixing with other musicians, playing alongside and eventually deputizing for his father in the orchestra at St. Mark's, provided an ideal musical atmosphere in which his talents could develop. But, surprise, surprise, he decided not to take up music as a profession, but embarked upon a career in the church, becoming ordained as a priest in 1703. Within a year, on account of ill health, a chest complaint, probably asthma, he left the church and embarked upon the career that was to make him one of the most famous of Venetian composers, a maestro indeed. His first employment as a musician was to teach violin at the Ospedale della Pieta, an orphanage and conservatory in Venice. It was an all-female institution. I suppose the fact that he was also a priest helped persuade those that appointed him that he was, as it were, morally safe. He must have been. He was employed at the Pieta for most of his life, although he was dismissed and reinstated with alarming regularity, perhaps on account of his stormy and difficult personality. He did have a shock of red hair and was referred to as the Red Priest. The girls of the Pieta sang and played one or more instruments: violin, organ, flute, oboe, bassoon, even trumpet. Vivaldi thus had at his disposal a permanent orchestra of the highest standard that inspired him to experiment with form and orchestration, the results of which were to have a profound effect on the development of music in the whole of the 18th century. By the time he had completed his first two sets of compositions, his style was set and remained more or less unchanged for the rest of his life.
The lyricism of Vivaldi's music owes much to his surroundings. In the early 18th century, when Vivaldi was an active composer, Venice was celebrated for its extraordinary beauty. It was unique, and not just in its buildings. The Venetian attitude to life was very different. In marked contrast to the repressive climate which prevailed in the rest of Europe, Venice was openly carnal, indulgent, and libertine. At carnival time, the whole city would give itself over to wild abandon. For days on end, all manner of madness and indiscretions were openly permitted. People danced, sang, ate, revelled, gambled, and made love throughout the city. Music and love of music flourished in such a climate. Vivaldi was unable to resist the lure of the carnival as inspiration for this piece. His music reflects the exuberance and the excitement. The jovial tone of the two mandolins as they trade melodies perfectly captures the spirit of playful interaction characterized by Carnival.
Vivaldi was now in demand as a soloist, and with his reputation established in Venice, it wasn't long before his fame spread abroad. His music was published in Venice, Paris, Amsterdam, and London. Having excelled as a composer of instrumental music, he turned his attention to opera, producing his first one in Vicenza in 1713. It was a great success, and he went on to write many more. He also saw a way to make even more money. He was obsessed with it. He promoted the operas himself. He became not only the maestro, but also the impresario. He traveled extensively, certainly to Amsterdam, Vienna, and Prague, for the purposes of promoting his operas. He was accompanied on his travels by a singer, Anna Giraud. She was apparently very pretty, but not highly rated as a singer, although, predictably, she was usually cast in the leading roles in his operas. Her sister, Peolina, went on the road with them as well, probably as a nurse for Vivaldi. Although he denied any impropriety, tongues do wag, you know, I don't think he would have risked the attendant scandal over a period of 14 years or so on the road without enjoying some of its fruits. But who knows? However, before he began this period of his life, he had written the Four Seasons, using all the tricks of the composer's trade and his not inconsiderable skills as an orchestrator to paint pictures with sound, and very convincingly too. Mind you, he took the precaution of prefacing each piece with a sonnet describing that particular season, and then marked the appropriate moments corresponding to the words in each concerto. Birdsong, depicted by happy little trills, violin tremolandi, marking the approach of thunder, pizzicati describing falling raindrops, and so on. Together with Pachelbel's celebrated canon and Albinoni's adagio for organ and strings, the Four Seasons are among the favorite items in the Baroque repertoire.
The famous suite of concertos, popularly known as the Four Seasons, is comprised of 4 separate violin concertos. Vivaldi wrote each to represent a specific season. In this piece, he represents the harsh winters of northern Italy. Vivaldi was only too aware of his inspiration and sought to describe in music what he thought it was like to shiver icily in the freezing dark in the teeth of a cruel wind. Vivaldi could compose with extraordinary speed. No doubt this ability contributed to Vivaldi's vast output. In 1715, he claimed to have written 10 concertos in only 3 days. This speed has also produced marked criticism. Vivaldi was not above repeating phrases in more than one composition. Stravinsky noted, "Vivaldi is greatly overrated, a dull fellow who composes the same form over and so many times over." A critic observed that he was an excellent violinist, but a mediocre composer. But the endearing qualities of the work meant Vivaldi had the last word. The violin tells a story.
Like so many composers that followed him, Vivaldi died in poverty. He had gone to Vienna in June 1741 to make some money, in fact, to sell some more concertos. He died there a month later and was buried the same day with a minimum of expense, as was Mozart some 50 years later. It's easy to judge Vivaldi's character when viewed through his business activities. One tends to see the least attractive side. But it's through his music and its subsequent influence that we should evaluate his true worth. His development of the concerto style was to influence all forms of composition in the 18th century and was a very important stage in the evolution of the classical symphony. Bach certainly regarded him as a composer of some importance and, in fact, transcribed 10 of Vivaldi's concertos. He was certainly a gifted orchestrator. The Four Seasons alone are evidence of that, and with his preference for expression rather than detail in his music, the pungent effects of his forward-looking harmony, the abrupt changes from major to minor modes, just as Schubert was to do, perhaps Vivaldi was the harbinger of Romanticism. It's worth considering. But one thing's for sure. In his attempt to paint pictures through music, he succeeded brilliantly in capturing the spirit and image of the golden age in which he flourished. We shall not look upon his like again.